Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Suparang Sitarit. I'm currently a fourth-year student here at PGVIM. I would like to welcome you guys to the third day of Princess Kalyaniwatana Institute of Music International Symposium 20 and 23. For our wonderful morning session today, two speakers will be moderated by Associate Professor Dr. Donna Weston, the Deputy Director from Queensland Conservatorium, Griffith University, Australia. So please welcome Dr. Donna to the stage. Thank you for being here with us and thank you for being a moderator. Thank you.
Now that I have been introduced, I will introduce our first speaker, Dr. Paul Craenen from the Royal Conservatoire of The Hague, who is going to speak to us about a topic dear to my heart, sustainability of art music and how we can and should examine classical music values in the context of new possibilities. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me here. It's a real honor and a pleasure, and it's a shame that I have to leave tomorrow morning, I have to say. Well, next time better, I would say. But I'm pretty excited about what I've heard in the past 2 days, because lots of the themes that came up in the sessions, but also during the concerts, resonate with what I would like to talk about today. So it will be mainly talking, I'm sorry for that, but maybe you can take that early in the morning. Anota invited me to share with you some thoughts about sustainability in higher music education, and she referred to a book we published at the Royal Conservatoire last year, a book with the title The Promise of Music, Hopes and Expectations in Higher Music Education. Now, there might be a slight difference between discussing what might be promising in music and reflecting on the sustainability of the musical practice. When the word sustainability is used today, it mostly happens from an ecological perspective, and then it usually evokes the sense of an imminent crisis. It suggests that the way we live today is not sustainable at all, and therefore we need to take action in order to preserve natural resources, but also to safeguard those things we consider essential and precious in life. Therefore, striving for sustainability almost always means protecting something. It implies a conservative reflex, which in a way resonates well with concerns in the field of classical music. Here is a quote from Simon Rattle, a renowned conductor, in a response to the budget cuts by the Arts Council in England and at the BBC, with the recent announcement to discontinue the BBC singers earlier this year. I think it finally didn't happen, but anyway, it was a direct response in a speech. I quickly read it. When the two largest supporters of classical music in this country cut away at the flesh of our culture in this way, it means that the direction of travel has become deeply alarming. It's clear we are facing a long-term fight for existence. We understand that this is a time of belt tightening and that change is inevitable. And we could help if we were ever asked or consulted. Because classical music is still a very fragile, interconnected ecosystem, and we know about adapting it without damaging any of the vital functions along the way. So reading this quote, it's clear that there is a sense of being at the brink at a total collapse. And by linking it to the metaphor of a fragile ecosystem, it sounds even more dramatic. Another prominent musician, pianist Maria João Pires, in an interview for the French radio recently, even more bluntly stated that in a few years' time, there won't be any more classical artists. Now, she was not referring to budget cuts directly, but to music education, which in her view has absolutely nothing to do with it, and with it she means the classical art. Therefore, she curiously proposes to participate in neuroscientific programs to capture something of the details, and I guess she means the complexity of this art form before it is completely lost. It reminds me of one of the first sessions at the symposium with, I think it's called the Nora tradition here in Thailand. Now, the death of classical music has been announced many times throughout the 20th century. And indeed, many institutions have disappeared. But at the same time, and I believe it's worth more attention, there is also a remarkable resilience of institutions of higher music education. Because here we are, deep in the 21st century, in a young institution for art music in Thailand. And feeling the energy here in this institution, I would say, not dead yet, and even very alive. So what is it then that young musicians motivates to choose for a musical career today in this field? Where or what is their hope in music? These were our questions when making the plan for this book, The Promise of Music, a few years ago. And instead of focusing on this feeling of loss in classical music, we were more curious about what might hold a new potential, a promising potential. And for this exercise, I found it crucial to also include the visions of our students in this exercise. So we stepped to 6 teachers and 11 students with the question of what they were hoping for in their musical art teaching practice. And their responses were very diverse, I have to say. Some were very personal, others more philosophical. Some were quite optimistic, although many also had a more mixed perspective that combines hope with concerns. So in this talk, I'm trying to balance those two perspectives, the concerns about sustainability with the more hopeful perspectives. And I will refer not so much to the book, but mainly to research I've conducted on proposals of master students in the context of what we call the master project at the Conservatoire in The Hague. Now, the master project is an overarching kind of format introduced a few years ago, in which students have to connect their artistic development with a research topic of their own choice and activities in the professional sphere that they can define and design themselves as well. So they have a lot of autonomy, and I use this autonomy as a starting point to gain new insights in what really drives the upcoming generation. And for my research, I analyzed almost 300 of these proposals, all from the past 3 years. All of these proposals came from music performance students, meaning I did not include composition students or students from education or teacher training. The majority of them were from the classical department. These are the blue ones on the slide, next to students in early music, jazz, vocal studies, and 2 smaller programs with only a few students. I apply different forms of analysis, but I will only focus on a thematic analysis I conducted here. I looked for emerging themes in these proposals, and this led me to define 27 thematic categories, of which you see the result here. Now, it's rather small and detailed. I can tell a lot about it, but I will come back to some of these themes when discussing sustainability. For now, it suffices to point to some general observations. At the bottom, you see the most popular theme students engage with, and that's the topic of the repertoire itself. More than 100 students focus their proposal on a specific work or a composer, which is not surprising knowing that the majority of them came from the classical and the early music department. It also explains the popularity of other topics such as practice development of skills and methods or playing techniques. But in between these themes, we also find a different trend. Look at the second largest category at the bottom, labeled with the notion of curatorship, or a bit higher, musical crossovers, or improvisation as well. These topics point at what I would call a creative turn amongst music performance students. Now, how can we connect these results to sustainability? First, let me identify 4 areas of concern and related questions in the field of art music that have a direct relevance to higher music education. I will not talk about cuts in subsidies and things like that, because these are really very real concerns, but not something we have a direct impact on. Let's start with the picture at the top left. This is our brand new concert hall in The Hague at Amare. We are very proud of it. And for most institutions, this kind of picture still defines what it means to be a classically trained musician. It's a stage in a concert hall, designed to experience live music in the best acoustic conditions, in front of a silent and attentive audience. Now, this format has become a matter of concern in recent decades, primarily because of the aging and declining concert hall audience. And our students are very much aware of this. In most cases, they're faced with the fact that when they are performing, the audience in the hall is at least twice as old as themselves. The second area of concern is the music itself. In classical music, the transmission of musical heritage in the form of musical works is still central. But it cannot be denied that there are growing doubts whether we can still fully trust the values of artistic quality and excellence that are firmly rooted in this work-based tradition. These may be doubts about the social relevance and impact of this type of music, to more critical perspectives that challenge the Western, some would also say male and colonial perspectives on music in this tradition. A third area of concern relates to the way music is produced, experienced, and consumed today. Only a tiny part of music's production is meant to be experienced in a live setting, let alone a concert hall. And a part of the activities of a professional musician may take place in recording studios to create musical content or products that can be experienced in a variety of ways. But streaming technologies have also introduced an economic model in the music industry that, I would say even more than before, is based on volume and a huge quantity of clicks. And as we all know, except for some of the big names and maybe some therapeutical neoclassical piano music, we talked about it yesterday, this is not a viable model for most professional musicians. But even more importantly, for higher music education, this model also leads to other and more fragmentary modes and habits of listening. On streaming platforms, there is a constant competition for the attention of the listener, and the technology radically shifted the focus towards the consumer. I remember when I was a teenager, we already were able to make our own music compilations, and we used devices called cassette recorders for this. The other day I had to explain my son what this thing was meant for. I felt really, really old. But at least we still had to wait for the right moment to push the record button and also wait until the music was finished to stop the recording. Now today algorithms are doing the work for us and adapt almost instantaneously to the mood of the music consumer. How can art music, a genre where some form of listening effort is expected, be sustainable in such an attention economy? Finally, a fourth area of concern that is often brought up when discussing sustainability of classical music is the place of this type of music in education in general. And I think it's very important for our students as well, since most professional musicians will not only perform, but at some point in their career also teach or share their music in other ways. Now, to what extent can we find a response from our students to these four areas of concern? I will take them one by one and try to match them with corresponding themes that I found in my analysis. And let us start with the first area, with the concert format. I already mentioned curatorship. Many students aim to experiment with the concert format in various ways, such as performing music outside the concert hall. This is nothing new, but the fact that performance students are proposing it, and sometimes at very unusual places, is maybe a new kind of thing to observe. Here, for instance, well, maybe just let us listen to some sounds. What we hear is a cello student. Stop. Okay. Experimenting with the acoustics of a cave in the south of France. It's a cave where traces have been found of very early human culture, some 30,000 years ago. Like painting on the walls, but also traces of musical culture, like bone flutes, one of the earliest instruments ever found. And within his research project, this master student combined his interests in archaeology with creating a context for an imaginative musical evocation of and connection to the past. As you can read in the quote from his master research, this is not from his proposal. I was dreaming of these tribes walking in there around me, engraving, singing. I was dreaming of their voices. Another example comes from an Italian master student living in the Dolomites, a mountain region in the north of Italy. And she knew several people in her environment who lost a relative or a friend in the mountains due to an accident, like an avalanche. And she proposed to start a summer series of concerts where the relatives and the friends of the missing person would go up in the mountains together with some musicians and have a concert there, make a kind of a musical tribute with a newly composed piece based on the name of the missing person and by making a connection between the music and the environment. Now, why I'm using these two rather extreme examples is that the environment becomes part of what we could call a narrative within and around performance. And in general, I have to say that I found this as a kind of recurring interest into a lot of the proposals, an interest into a theme that has been brought up in this symposium as well, storytelling. Yesterday we heard John Cage say in a video, I was talking to Peter about this, that sounds don't have to mean anything. Now, if I read the proposals of many students, it seems as if they want their music to be about something. In my own article in the book, I describe this trend as making a contrast with a cherished, highly cherished value, I would say, in classical music, namely the value of music's autonomy, the idea that music can create a world on its own. And the concert hall, in a way, is the embodiment of this value. It seems that, at least for some of our students, this ideal may also lead to isolation, and therefore they are searching for new ways and new narratives to connect their music to the world in different ways. This connectivity can also be found in the great interest in interdisciplinary approaches. Many students in their proposals engage with other artistic disciplines like theater, dance, poetry, but we also had some interesting examples in the past years of students connecting with food. Here we have like our Thai student, our former Thai student, Nopakern. I also have to exercise his name, Eserinokro. I think it's right. No? Yeah. Well, let's hear just like a few sounds. If it works. Yeah, okay. So he's experiencing the salty taste and crispy sounds of eating chips while playing a composition called Taste Me, which was the result of his research in so-called cross-modal correspondences between taste and sound. And last year, we had an early music student who cooked himself small seasonal dishes that had to be eaten during the music that he composed and performed himself. It was really a fantastically developed kind of research. I invite you to look at it at the research catalog, which is our platform for sharing research. It's very beautiful to look, see, and listen. And he also had participants in his experiment. Nopakern, the other student, had to do everything on his own because that was during COVID, but he had the chance to be able to work with participants. And these were really important for his research because he could ask them, interview them about their experience of this combination of eating something and listening to something. And that led to new insights and adaptations of the format. And especially since the COVID pandemic, we see a growing interest of students in the audience perspective. This is something new, I would say. The shift of, it's not only what I have to tell, but also maybe how it can be received at the other end. It may lead to doing interviews, but also applying more playful and game-like strategies to activate the audience. I'm not sure if this will work, but for instance, here, there was also something of that in it. I have stronger examples, but the audience got a cue, like if you hear a pizzicato, 2 pizzicato tones, you can have a bite, something like that. Which is very, oh, no, this is not what I wanted. No, well, I propose you look it up. But it's a very effective strategy. So it invites the audience to be really attentive. I was talking about attentive listening. It's a very simple strategy, and it worked very well, I have to say. Oh, there it was. Okay. Technology. The growing interest into the audience perspective, of course, also leads to questions about the choices of repertoire. This doesn't mean that students give up their own preferences. Many see for themselves a future as an ambassador for their practice, for their repertoire. But zooming in on their repertoire proposals, some interesting trends can be observed. To start with, European students seem to lose their interest into the canonical repertoire. This is something that I started to notice. I'm not sure if this is a trend or maybe a coincidence, but it seems that it is often Asian students who still engage with this repertoire. Maybe because they feel less of the burden of the Western tradition, might be the case, and that in itself might also be very interesting for the future of this repertoire. But for many students, a motivation for engaging with repertoire lies in the search for unknown or forgotten works or underrepresented composers. And especially, I would say, amongst female students, this often means focusing on works of female composers. We clearly see concerns about representation in the classical music field. And in their choices of repertoire, we find a commitment of students to do something about it. What also struck me in analyzing the proposals is that many students try to make a connection with their identity or roots. This may happen very simply through focusing on a composer of their hometown. But students coming from outside Europe also often try to make a connection with their cultural background, and that sometimes also leads to establishing some form of intercultural exchange. Such an exchange may also invite to make musical crossovers between Western and other types of traditional music, or to different genres like jazz, pop, folk, early music, classic. And making such crossovers also involves strategies of improvisation or arranging skills to adapt music to other styles, situations, and genres. And as you can see on the slide, all of these topics are quite popular in the proposals of students. Look at the numbers. And these are part of what I called before this creative turn in performance. Now, what about the relation of students to the new technologies that have such an enormous impact on the way music is consumed today? I believe the situation is a bit more complicated here, because the identity of classically trained musicians is to a large extent determined by their relationship with a standardized instrument. And in the most cases, this instrument didn't change for at least a century. Mastering these instruments implies developing skills from a pre-electronic or pre-digital era, which may form a hindrance for students to engaging with new technologies in a deep way. We can find many exceptions to this, especially among students with a more technical or computer science interest or background. We've had some students developing their own apps, for instance. Some also speculate or experiment with possibilities of virtual reality. I refer to Nopakorn, the guitar player, the Thai student, since we are in Thailand and representation is important. I have another quote from Nopakorn, because he also contributed to the book, The Promise of Music here. I read it. Imagine how spectacular the day will be when we can listen to Debussy's Prélude à l'après-midi d'un faune on damp grass, surrounded by the virtual smell of pine and cinnamon, and a similarly virtual pinch of bitterness in our mouths. The gravitational force gradually declines, and we are all slowly floating into the air as we arrive in D-flat major. The bitterness slowly turns to sweetness. So, and so it goes on. Well, imagination is at work, I would say. And here we see an example. I'm not sure, the internet is not working on my computer, I'm afraid. But this is an example from a student, I will try, who developed her own instrument. She's experimenting with a prototype here. Doesn't seem to work. Okay, no. And as you can see, you could also hear it, she makes an interaction with the environment as well. Here on the, it's very small and it's blurry. There is even a kind of little windmill, a sensor that takes in the information of the speed of wind, which plays a role in the effects on the instrument. Changing the position of the instrument makes an effect on the sound, and she even integrated the possibility for the audience to interact with what she is doing through wireless technologies. So very innovative kind of an entrepreneurial example of a research project of a student, but it's probably no coincidence that this student also had a background in composition. And in general, I would say it's fair to say that new technologies are more prominent among composers than among performers. However, especially since COVID, also performing students seem to become more interested into developing recording skills to start with, because it makes them more independent, not only as performers, but also as music producers. Finally, every year we also get proposals from students who want to engage in co-creative or community work, making music together with kids or with patients in hospitals and so forth. This group remains fairly small, I have to say. As you can see in the number, 15 means just over 5% of the music performance students who engage in such explicitly socially focused work. Here I have to say that I didn't include music education students in my analysis, which would change the image completely, of course. Nevertheless, it's no coincidence that at our Conservatoire, an obligatory component of educational skills has been introduced for all students at the undergraduate level. And I'm convinced this is relevant, since thinking about the sustainability of the musical practice should perhaps first of all start with the creation of new communities of music practitioners. I remember we were yesterday at a dinner table talking about this. We tend to forget that at the heydays of classical music culture in Europe at the end of 19th century, let us say, probably a majority of the audience had had some form of music education in the practical sense. Think alone of the presence of pianos in the bourgeois households at the time. And I strongly believe that an embodied understanding of music may be crucial to sustain a listening culture that requires a form of attentive listening, which perhaps may be one of these precious values I referred to at the beginning in classical music that are worth defending. Moreover, this more embodied experience in musical culture may also partly answer the question, what explains this resilience of higher music education institutions I referred to at the beginning? My interpretation of this is this. When young people apply for the Conservatoire, they already went through a whole trajectory of intensive musical training, of year-long intensive training. And through this process of becoming a musician, they are already musicians when they enter. They discovered a whole range of values. Aesthetical values, the joy to be creative with sound, the connectedness with immaterial heritage. But I would also say, most of all, it's probably the number one value in the proposals of students, this incredible joy to play together with others. It comes back time and again in all these proposals. It's not a topic in itself, but it's a motivation for many of them. And I have the impression that these values are so important that they make up for the insecurity of becoming a professional musician, at least to some extent. Coming so far, these young musicians don't give up so easily their musical dream. So how can we help them to become ambassadors for these values? That would be my conclusion. Looking at the wealth and the diversity of the proposals in the first two areas, and if you look at the numbers there, I believe we should trust the creativity of the young generation to innovate the concert format and to engage with musical heritage in meaningful ways. But for the other two areas, the challenges are so big, and I think there is so much work to be done that we can't shift this responsibility to students alone. I believe we should turn our institutions into labs for music in society. And a lab means the doing of research, which may include interdisciplinary research, also engaging with knowledge from other fields, but also research in and through practice, which we tend to call artistic research in Europe, or at least continental Europe. And having witnessed the development of artistic research, especially at the third level, doctoral level, in the past 2 decades, I'm looking at there at the right side, there is somebody involved in that as well. I have to say that there is no doubt that the overwhelming majority of the artistic research projects were all focused on the first two areas, on the repertoire, on the concert format, to a lesser extent, but also increasingly, on technologies in music. But the fourth area is seriously lagging behind or simply lacking. I think there are several reasons for this, but there is a kind of gap between artistic and educational research or participatory research. And I strongly believe that in some sense we have to bridge that gap in the upcoming years. Because I believe that all the issues we are facing in the first two areas come back in community work or educational work and need a very concrete response in these areas. So that's where I think work to be done. This was all based on what I could observe in The Hague. I hope that it somehow resonates with what you can observe in other places. That was it.
Moderate some questions for you. Oh yeah, thank you, Paul. I think that the data from the students clearly shows that they're challenging some embedded assumptions, and that they may be endangering the future of art music more so than any funding cuts. So I guess highlighting those values is really important. But I open the floor to some questions for Paul, or comments, please. Sorry, there's light straight at my eye.
Don't worry. Thanks, Paul, for that very exciting presentation. I'm very happy that we coincide on the judgment on streaming technologies. But my question is a very simple one. Okay, I need the microphone. But you understood the first part, I think, of my question.
Yeah, sure.
Good. What was the reason that you excluded composition students from that research?
Very simple. At the time, it's just a kind of research methodology question. I did like research on 3 years of master proposals, and the first 2 years, the composition students were not yet included. Like always, they are a bit behind. They prefer to be on their own island. To be on their own island, they don't want to be engaged in what happens as in reforms at other places. But now they are part of the community, so they are part of this new system. So in an update, I will include them. And actually, I have gone through their research project, so I know a bit what is happening over there. And of course, it's a bit different, but in a way also not very much. So the same themes. I think one of the most striking things for me is indeed that these distinctions between departments are vanishing quite rapidly. The interests into these topics, many of these are interests of composers since 2 decades. But suddenly you see it entering it in performance departments, and you see that all these, the distinction is becoming less important, actually. Yeah.
I'm still not following about the ideas of the composition department, because I think most of the people, you yourself is composers, and we also attempting, and I know in YST they're attempting, the person who sort of like puts these kind of things are all composers in a way. But what happened in the composition department? I mean, is it? Do you know what I mean?
Do you mean what?
Because I have a feeling even the person who kind of sort of like initiate these ideas into a performance department, mostly composers.
I'm not sure about that anymore.
Is it coming from the composers provoking, or is it performers sort of like come to this?
Depends on the place, and I think in The Hague it's really like that.
Yeah.
In my place, or in Freiburg, for example, it's completely opposite.
Yeah. No, of course, but well, again, what I said about the composition department was not yet part of it. That has nothing to do with the students, but of course with the teachers, and with like a department, the way a department is run. So they were just not part of the master project reform at the time. So when I started doing these analysis, so it's just like a formal reason. But of course there are, like I was at in the research committee 2 years ago at the composition department, and I saw actually the same. Funnily enough, 3 of the 8 composers were dealing with how to bridge the gap between performers and composers. So it's not that the topics are really different. It seems that the things that are there is one difference. Maybe the attentive kind of ones have looked seen it at the graph when I showed you the statistics of my themes. There are some surprising things at the top, where the very unpopular kind of themes. There is, for instance, ecology, 3 out of 291, which is striking. But that's also because these were performance students. And out of these 3 performance students, I think there was only one who made herself some kind of connection to ecology, and the 2 others had to use composers from the composition department to engage with this topic of ecology. But ecology is much more present, for instance, in the composition department. To give just one example, it's easier for them to go beyond that instrument. That is a kind of barrier sometimes to engage with certain themes, or
Okay, well, first, can I follow on just one question? I'm so sorry. I'm just asking, do you see that in these 3 years, is there any increasing trends of students collaborating with people from other departments? And also these gaps also between not just performers, composers, but performer with music educator. Yeah.
Yeah, well, very quickly answer the first question, definitely yes. So there is collaboration is another of these themes. I should have mentioned it actually, but it's a bit in this playing together as a kind of core value today. Instead of focusing on your own, and it also transcends the departments. But it's not the case with education. That's why I emphasize this so much. It is really as if the students that choose for the music educator master program are a different kind of profile. There is a kind of reluctance to engage with each other somehow. I also felt it is in the field of artistic research, to be honest. This not only comes from the field of artistic research, it also comes from the other side. There is also more of, I would say, I would almost say a more academic kind of perspective on what is relevant or what should be done if you engage with education, because so many things need to be taken into account. That educators also think like, well, wait a minute, if you come here and just do something, it's not so easy. It is much more involved. So it is a kind of gap there, but I think it would be really relevant for both sides, to make the education, to have more artistic impulses in the education department. That would be my suggestion. And the other way around, to draw on the expertise of educators of how to engage with people. So I think there is a real value, and I'm making this plea also towards Peter. We should really open up for this kind of artistic research that is really artistic research, but with a focus on what happens between people when you make music. Yes.
Paul, thank you very, very much. You had a statement about labs. Just this builds on your last point. What was the actual 4 or 5 words again? Labs?
Labs for music in society.
Exactly. So if it's labs for music and society, and taking your last point, this needs to be something clearly that is impacting on pedagogy from the beginning.
Yeah.
The other so it was just that it's a bigger, it's huge, and it'd be wonderful
huge
to be working this forward in collaboration between organisations to make this change, because it's massive. The other one that I found really interesting was the concept that in the perception from The Hague and from other places in Europe that people coming from Asian cultures are more likely to be seeking the repertoire-based studies. Having been in Southeast Asia for 15 years, I find this so deeply ironic that the cultures themselves are integrated and non-siloed and creative, and food, fashion, and film and music and costume can all be interacting. But then there's this perception, it's almost like it is a sort of colonized perception that actually we're potentially needing to go to do this other thing. And I want to push it because I've got some, in the 30 under 30 group, for example, in Southeast Asia, this is a theme that is coming up from them. They want the fusion, but they're confused by messaging through their secondary schooling and so on that they'll only be good when they become specifically expert. It's a really complex one, and there's not an answer, but it's just to say that your Thai guitarist, for example, I mean, there's no end of Southeast Asian musicians coming through that where that's normal and not exotic. And yet when it gets into the European context, the risk is it becomes seen as if they need to... at the worst, this becomes genuinely abusive in Europe. It becomes, if you don't do what I tell you, then why have you come to Europe? So it's with certain teachers, I mean, that's again an actual case quoted to me by a Southeast Asian pianist in Vienna. So do you see what I mean? There's an extension of this, but I think the work you're doing, is profound. It needs to be at the front of the curriculum, obviously. And how do we do that is the collective challenge. But beautiful. And it's great to have the data that demonstrates where people are actually wishing to go when they have agency. So
yes.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Just one thing, I understand what you're... I've not so much examples from Asian students, but I have some in mind that also shine a bit of a different light. Sometimes it comes also out of themselves, like wanting to engage with a certain piece of that they really like. And I was also just pointing at the other side of the perspective, the fact that if we tend to become a bit uninterested in the European heritage, as Europeans, I'm speaking now, and people from elsewhere see a value in it and do something with it, then I'm very curious what happens. And I've also remember very well this Chinese opera singer 2 years ago, a very good one actually, who did the research on Verdi in China. Of course, that is a theme in itself. There is a lot of literature also, the colonial perspectives on this as well. But he really asked this deep question: why is Verdi so much more popular in China than it is in the Netherlands? And what is it actually, what is attractive about it? So I think it's really interesting also if there is this cross-cultural, I would not say exchange because that's an empty word, but interest. And that leads to doing something without, and being quite relaxed about it, about doing something with the repertoire. So that's also another side, yeah.
I thought I'd blown it. Thank you. Just very quick questions. Thank you for that. That was really enjoyable and stimulating. So when there was a graph there of the data sets, and it seemed that singers were separated from performers. Was I right in seeing that? You had vocal...
No. Vocal is part of,
As part of, okay.
of the total of,
the total data.
performance,
Okay.
yes.
Cool. The other question, just briefly, then, is the students that are making up the sample in their undergraduate years, are the music education and the performance students, are they sharing a core curriculum, or are they discrete curricula from the outset? I'm just wondering about that division that you're sort of alluding to between performers and music education students.
I'm more involved with the master's level, but I think there is indeed a quite strict separation between the education training and the undergraduates as well, yes.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Yeah.